So ultimately, what we're talking about is what does your child need to access the learning, not what does your child need to live free of pain or suffering or stress, but what does your child need to access the learning at school? And
So
so that's
talk about
another big piece.
the tools in specific, like the 504 and the IEP, that a parent can utilize to help their child get access to learning. How do they, one, start that process? But then two, the biggest thing is, what's the difference between the two?
Ugh, big questions. And those are good
Sorry.
questions, really good questions. No. They're really good
He's on
questions.
vacation, Andrea.
I know, I'm sorry.
And ultimately, for this podcast to be helpful to your listeners, this is something that they're all going to have as questions. And this is the question we get all the time.
Yeah.
The tools you have to utilize as a parent to get your kid help are the IEP, which stands for Individualized Educational Plan or Program, or a 504, right? And these are both aspects of the IDEA law, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And these are really important aspects of the law. Like I said, it's a right, not a privilege. They're very different because one is more difficult and nuanced than the other. So if your child has any sort of disability, physical, learning, whatever, and it limits their ability to learn, they might be eligible for an individualized educational plan. Because what we need to do as a team, we need to figure out what does your child need to access the learning, because they're not doing the learning like all their other typical peers. They need something else, whatever it might be, right? They're limited. And so if they are eligible with a disability, they can get an IEP. So a disability is when generally a psychologist or a medical professional finds that there is something limiting the child's ability to access life. And with respect to learning and with respect to accessing school, there are 13 disabilities
Oh, I
that
didn't know that.
that we look for. And if the child has any of those disabilities, then they could probably get an IEP. And we're talking like physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, sensory disabilities, mental illnesses, neurological disabilities. But there are 13 very specific ones. And that's what psychologists look for.
So do they have to have a diagnosis then to get an IEP?
A diagnosis is a medical aspect. So, no,
Okay.
psychologists do not diagnose. They present their findings after much assessment, and they can provide children with a label of a disability. So,
Okay.
I don't know if you'd call that a diagnosis, honestly, because if your child is found to be presenting enough aspects of the autism spectrum disorder, then we can label them with an autism disability. Does that make sense? If your child is unable to access the hearing portion of their learning and the audiologist finds that they're limited in their hearing more than 80%, let's say, then they can be labeled with a deaf or hard of hearing disability. So there are these labels, basically, these 13 labels that we can put onto a child so that they're eligible for an IEP.
Okay.
Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Um, and it can be physical. There's an umbrella term called other health impairment, OHI. Sometimes you'll have ADHD will fit into that. Sometimes other types of learning disabilities may fit into that. You could have a physical disfigurement or a physical disability, which might allow for them to get a label of a disability. You could have a traumatic brain injury. You could be visually impaired. You could have a speech or language impairment. Any of these might get you different types of disabilities, which will allow for an IEP. Okay?
Okay.
More than likely, the parents listening to this who have questions, it won't be very straightforward, right? It won't be a super straightforward situation where, oh, I've known since he was 2 that he's probably on the autism spectrum. Oh, we've known since he was 3 that he's blind. Oh, you know what I mean? It may not be. Oftentimes, the hard ones they're not very clear. We're
Yeah.
just not sure what's going on
And they
because
change a lot, it sounds like, too.
they
Changes
change
through a
as they grow
child's.
too.
Yeah.
So it could be something that is more of a disorder, to use a more clinical term, because remember, if it's not fitting into one of the 13 disability categories, they can still get help via a 504 plan. And they could have a health issue or something that affects their life. Think asthma, think attention, think something that significantly affects their ability to learn, but
Mm-hmm.
isn't necessarily a disability. You could say an anxiety disorder might be a good one to play with because
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't necessarily fit nicely under a disability that a psychologist would say, oh, that's a disability, right?
Yeah.
But it may significantly limit their ability to learn, right? They
Mm-hmm.
may be missing out on a lot of school. They may not be able to do PE with their peers. They may not be able to do recess with their peers. Who knows? They may not be able to take tests. You name it. There's a million different reasons why they may not be accessing the learning. So if that's the case, if it's not one of the 13 disabilities that a psychologist would find, then it might be something that's eligible for a 504 plan. And a 504 plan is really kind of like an IEP with no teeth almost, right? Because a 504 plan doesn't come attached with money from the federal government. So there's no
Oh.
special education teacher attached to a 504 plan, right? If a child is struggling with accessing the learning, but they don't have a special education disability, they still need help. The
Mm-hmm.
help is going to come from the school. The help is going to still come from the team at school. There just won't be a special education manager attached to the child helping them to access. It may be more of the school counselor or the general education teacher along with the assistant principal, or you name it. And a 504 plan could just be designed to help them access their learning on a day-to-day basis based on their
So
need.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here for just
Okay.
a minute because I'm a parent now that just heard that the IEP, I mean, the 504 is the IEP with no teeth. So I'm thinking, whoa, I want to make sure
Right.
my kid gets the IEP because
Sure.
there's no
Sure.
funding that goes with it.
Sure. 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 Sure.
Um, Help me believe that the 504 is going to be helpful to my child as well.
Yep. Yep. And again, remember what we talked about, the Porsche versus the car, right?
Right.
What are we talking about? This is your child, right? In your mind, your
Yeah.
child deserves only the
The
best,
Porsche.
the Porsche. But is the Porsche necessary to drive down the road?
No.
No. We just want to get your child down the road, right? We don't need to get them down the road in style. So if the team finds that it's not necessary for them to have all the bells and whistles with money attached in order to learn, then we're not going to advise that, because that would be fiscally and almost morally irresponsible of us to assign your child a special education case manager, a teacher, services, minutes of the day, yada, 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 if they don't need that to learn, right? So
Mm-hmm.
let's take two kids. Let's take a kid with asthma and a kid with ADHD. This is broad ballpark stuff here, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
don't take my word for it. This is not every kid with ADHD gets an IEP, right? That is just
Mm-hmm.
not the
Right.
case. But in this situation, we've got child A and child B. Both children are not learning. Both children are struggling to learn. The child with asthma, child B, is never making it to school, unable to play at recess, unable to go out for PE, unable to keep up with his peers, missing a ton of
Yeah.
school, not learning, but due to asthma, let's say, okay?
Yeah.
The other child, child A, has attention deficit disorder. It's diagnosed by a doctor. It's real. They're taking medication, but they're still struggling, right? And they are just not making progress, and they are not accessing the learning. So most likely, the ADHD will more than likely provide them a disability eligibility. A psychologist would probably be able to fit them in under the category of OHI, which is other health impairment, because they could seriously utilize some major support from the team, because they're truly not accessing, because they've already gotten medication, they've already gotten all this other stuff, and they're still not learning, right? And so you almost want to pull out the big guns, right? And say, this kid really needs more help than just the diagnosis, the medication, the extra time on tests. It's just not working. They need more. And so an IEP becomes more appropriate at that point because they just need to learn and access and make their progress. The kid with asthma, the kid's got the inhaler. The kid doesn't need a full-blown team around them, because turns out if we give the kid the inhaler and the time to go to the office and use the inhaler when they need it, and to make sure that the teachers around them know to monitor them when they're running around a lot, then they actually end up doing just fine. And they're able to access the learning quite well. And so they don't need the full-blown team around them. They don't need a psychologist. They don't need a counselor. They don't need a special education teacher, because they're able to learn really with no problem. They just need to be in school. And in order to get them in school, we provide them the inhaler and everything else, and the time to use it and the place to use it. Good to go. So that's a perfect example of where the needs were so great that an IEP team really needs to hang out around child A and work on their goals and really spend time every year revamping. Child B really just needed some tweaks, right? And needed to make sure that they got what they need to succeed. Now, if child B were to move around from school to school, we would hate to have to relearn this asthma thing every time. So the 504 allows for the parents and the kid to go through this kind of once, get it in writing, so that it follows the kid, so that every school has to honor it. And so when I say no teeth, I mean maybe no money. And maybe that's a better way to use it, because it does have teeth. It's a 504 and you have to legally follow it. It's signed off on by the parents. It's a mandate. And when a kid walks in a 504, you have to follow it. It's just that simple. But it doesn't come attached with special education dollars, and it doesn't come attached with a lot of services and a lot of people. That's what the IEP does. And so really what it comes down to is level of need. There's an important piece to understand here, and it's called a free and appropriate public education. So when I talked about the Porsche, what I talk about is the level of appropriateness, because again, we're talking about a public school setting. We're talking about tax dollars at work. And in order for us not to bankrupt a public setting, we've got to be judicious about the monies that we do spend. That doesn't mean that we scrimp on kids who need it. We don't scrimp on kids who need it. We give kids who need things everything they need. What we don't do is we don't provide a Porsche for a kid who just needs a car. And so when you talk about a free and appropriate public education, that's what we're talking about.